the number one thing I think helped me was looking at saying, I have this cool idea for a story, which that's a very common thing that writers have. What is unique to every individual author then is, what is your superpower of sorts? I mean, that's such an overused term, but like, what is the talent you have that is exceptional that you can use to write this book? For me, it was lots of little ideas and how to and being able to string them together at speed.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Living the Next Chapter. I have a great guest on the show today. We're going to not swing from the chandelier, but we're going to be talking about the chandelier today. Ben is on the show. We're going to be talking about his book, and he's going to get some great tips for you as an author as well about how to do this whole thing about writing a book. Ben's got some great experience to share with you as well. We're going to just fall in love with a brand new book and a new author for you. For the first time hearing Ben, you're going to love Ben. He's amazing. Ben, welcome to Living the Next Chapter.
Dave, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So what is that? Is it Zia? Who is it that says we're going to swing from the chandelier? Who is that?
Yeah, it is actually. And when I mentioned I have I have a high school and a middle school student, and I have them. I have two children who are in high school and middle school. And when I mentioned to them the title, they all started, I wouldn't call it singing. They began screeching, warbling, that caterwauling, my grandmother would say, that chorus over and over again. And there it is. But as mentioned, Chandelier, available now on Amazon and benhawken.com.
So you have these rich pipes, Ben. I hear when you're talking, I love it. You mentioned you're going to do you're doing an audiobook as well for Chandelier?
Yeah. So the book itself went on sale on August 29th on Amazon, and it's also on Barnes and Nobles in case you want to pick it up in 1997. And now I'm in the process of recording the audiobook. So I'm on about page 480 out of the 528 pages of the book. So it is going to be available in the next few weeks.
Excellent. That's exciting. It's a big task to record your own voice and read your own book.
You know, you hear often how people hear their voice when they're listening to a voicemail, or they see a recording of themselves and they're like, oh my gosh, is that what I really sound like? And I've gotten past that. And now I'm on to, I can't handle making that noise anymore. It's just, I'm on chapter 40 right now, and there's just so much. And luckily there's a lot of services online where I can just record it, not fix any of my stumbles, just back up a sentence and start over again, and then just upload it to some people online who will just sit there with what I assume is a pirated version of Pro Tools and just chop it all up and do all the mastering and send it back to you for a very reasonable price. So authors out there, if you can find a way to get it recorded, there are a lot of sites online that'll help you with the mastering and the back end of the process.
Beautiful. I love it. Tell everybody where you are in this big world of ours, Ben. Where are you?
So I am I'm a mere 20 minutes outside of Seattle in a little town called Sammamish.
No, that's a nice name to say. I like that.
It's a mouthful. It has more M's than you expect, and next to a lake of the same name.
Nice.
And yeah, it's beautiful here. It's I grew up about 30 minutes south and grew up in South Seattle, and went east for school and work, and then got back here about 15 years ago. So I made the round trip.
So when Ben's not writing and being an amazing author and recording his own audiobook, what does Ben do to fill up his time?
There are so many kids at my house, Dave. There's at last count, there were 4.
Oh boy.
And then we picked up a dog during COVID, like everyone else. And so there's those, they all have expensive hobbies and sports and activities and musical performances. There's any given night of the week, I'm at one of those. And then I do triathlons just because as a misery indexing exercise. So it's, just staying busy.
Wow. Okay.
I mean, that sounds so obnoxious. I just like to stay busy, but no, triathlons are nice. And one of my kids tried one this year, and her feedback was the same as mine every time, which is, I hated that.
Yeah.
Do you know when they're doing another one?
Yeah.
And so keeps, but I mean, I find that if the writing, I mean, this is true with work, it's true with writing, it's true with a lot of things, that if you've gotten after it physically in the morning, then there are certain parts of your brain that are going to click on and stay on and longer and better during the course of the day. I think that's just basic physiology. And I mean, we could get into things like endorphins and synapses and other words I've heard but can't define or spell. But It makes a big difference. If you get after it in the morning, your writing will be better.
Okay. That's a good tip right off the bat. I like that. So what was the spark for you? Because I'm not an author. I've never written anything. So out of the two of us, you're the expert in the room here, which I love. So it's all on you. What was the spark for you to even start the journey to become an author?
Yeah. There is so many paths to writing something that's really important and really special, and probably in reverse order that it's really special. And I think that's what makes books so interesting. And that's why we have such a great variety of books, is the many different paths you can take to get there. Mine was that I have been writing for a living in like marketing and public relations and creative roles professionally for years, always in very small chunks. But I was able to string together that ability to, hey, let's have bursts of good ideas and that have to stand alone, or maybe we turn them into something that will last for a few weeks or a couple of months worth of a project or a campaign that we're going to do at work. But how can I take that ability to come up with those pops of ideas and then kind of string those together? And that's what to me was so interesting about finally writing a book was I've referred to it in a couple other times I've been talking about it, as it's like playing word games. It's like, how can we write ourselves out of this dramatic situation that we're in? Mm-hmm. But more than that, it is, I have a great idea for this chapter. Then this will happen, then this, and then the chapter concludes. And then we're going to pick up again at the next one. Well, you have to, hit for power and average on every single one of those. They have baseball in Canada, right, Dave? That metaphor works.
Yeah. We have Toronto. So Toronto. Yeah, there you go.
They have. I mean, you really can't afford to that chapter didn't really work. We'll get them on the next one. It is like, how consistent can you be? So my background was in creative writing, and I wrote and directed, just thousands of hours of material on for video content, and so I really brought all of that to bear for the book that I never ever planned on writing. Fortunately, I had this lightning strike moment of, that's a hell of an idea for a book. Mm. And my initial thought was, well, I don't write books. And then the third strike all in a row was, but if I did. Yeah. And I just tinkered with an outline that finally stretched to about 45 pages over the next 2 weeks. I think my idea of writing a book was just the tortured author where you chain yourself to a desk, and Hemingway's thing was writing's easy. You just cut your wrists and bleed on the keyboard, something to that effect. And I'm like, that's how you write books. You just sit there for days, and you're like Proust or Nietzsche, and you just are locked in a room writing for a year, and then you come out bedraggled at the end and you have a masterpiece. So I'm like, that sounds horrible. So I did none of those things. I spent just 2 weeks in spare moments in between meetings or weekends or while I'm watching TV, just tinkering with this outline and saying like, oh, that's an interesting idea. Where can I put that idea? And I would look at my outline. I'm like, seems like it would work in chapter 22. Right. And, then I would have like an idea for a character that I feel like we need someone who should do this. Where should they be from? So it isn't just people that look like me from the one town I'm from. Like, what else can we do to make this a more vibrant story and have like a global appeal, both in its audience, but also in its telling? And, I just took my time putting that outline together. And then once I had the structure all together, then I was really excited about it. And the writing happened pretty fast after that. So I had that idea on the 18th of August. And it was on Amazon on the 29th of August, a year later. Wow. So that part's not normal. That came from, you learn how to write under tight deadlines. You learn to write really fast. So I had that. That was my unnatural advantage. But aside from speed of writing, I had to learn everything else. While the plane was flying, I was learning how to fly it and assemble it.
So the key thing I'm taking away from this conversation so far is the word bedraggled. I've never used that in a sentence, and that's so cool. So that's what I learn about when I spend time with great people like you, is my vocabulary actually improves, and I'm not just using simple words, but bedraggled. Come on.
Bedraggled. And, and that's, I mentioned earlier, there's so many different paths to putting a book together. The number one thing I think helped me was looking at saying, I have this cool idea for a story, which that's a very common thing that writers have. What is unique to every individual author then is, what is your superpower of sorts. I mean, that's such an overused term, but like, what is the talent you have that is exceptional that you can use to write this book? For me, it was lots of little ideas and how to and being able to string them together at speed. But for other people, it's going to be world building. I think if there's any weakness of my book, it's the world building. I mean, my book happens entirely on planet Earth because the idea of like having to set a landscape somewhere else, never. If I had 10 years, I wouldn't have been able to do it. Other people, it's going to be how particularly strong dialogue. Like they have an ear for how people talk to one another. Other people might be able to to balance like the happy and the sad parts of a book, or like the tender moments and then the thriller moments. Like these are all skills that would have served me incredibly well, that I had to kind of learn as I went. But if you can identify early on, like what is exceptional about the tool set you're going to bring to this, and it can be something really, really small. Like, is it about pacing? Are you great at structure? Are you great at the framing and the formatting of the story itself? If you can figure out what that one thing is, like lean on that, make that 90% of what you're doing, like 90% of what you're doing up front. And then, figure out the rest as you go, because I don't think anyone is opening, unless you're 12 novels deep at this point, in which case I would like to ask you some questions. Like early on in your process, you're going to be learning as you go. You're going to come to it with 20% of what you need to know.
Right.
And, but that's what makes it super fun, is what you learn along the way and how you tweak all authors must do this. Well, it's how you tweak all of those things along the way to work for what you're trying to get it to do.
When we chatted before, we kind of talked a little bit about your background. You've done some ghostwriting, you've done some speech writing. Those are writing in the voice of someone else and how they would speak and how they would write. You're kind of you're putting their shoes on and writing in their shoes instead of your own voice. So what's different about writing in someone else's voice compared to writing in your own voice?
I spent a lot of years speech writing for a wide variety of people. Especially early in my career when I was working at creative agencies, and we would have clients at major companies or major personalities who needed things written because they were going to go speak at a conference, or they had to go, like, I have a panel that I'm going to be on and I need to have some opening remarks. There was one person in particular who was the celebrity endorser or celebrity face of the company for a subprime mortgage company back before we knew they were evil. This was 2006, 2005. And I wrote this person's speeches whenever they handed a giant check to someone and said, we're going to give you this soon to be upside down mortgage. We're going to pay for the first year of payments. And like, we wrote all these speeches, and this person would travel all over. I was in New York at the time, and they would travel all over the city to very touristy areas that people would recognize at a glance and hand big checks to people. And, so you name a topic or an industry, and I wrote a speech or two for it. Now, to be clear, those were all in the usually 5 to 10 minutes and occasionally 30 minutes. So once again, that was what I considered very long. Eventually, later on, when I was working in the tech industry, some of those speeches would get up to 50 minutes or 60 minutes, which, once again, tiny by comparison to what I later did for the book. That was what I considered super, super long at the time. But I remember thinking a lot about voice of the people I was writing for. And fairly early on in my career, I went to a conference for speechwriters, and I had been asked to cover like a very narrow topic about how do you use visuals and video to expand upon what you're talking about in a speech to help land one of your major points. And I'll tell you, speaking in front of a conference of speechwriters is a nightmare, because it's 500 people in the room who would all have done it differently. And all they're thinking the whole time is, nope, that wasn't very good. And like, bad tagline, stupid idea, not really that interesting. Why did he emphasize that word? It was a tough crowd. But one of the speakers was a gentleman who had recently retired. He'd been doing some work for whichever administration was in power at the time in DC. And he had recently retired and was there to talk about his experiences writing some speeches for JFK. Wow. He didn't write the famous ones, the Ich bin ein Berliner or the Ask Not What You Can Do for Your Country. I think I have that backwards, but Ask What Your Country Can Do for You. Yep, it was backwards. Anyway, he didn't write those two, he pointed out, but he had written a bunch. And then later on, he made a career out of it afterwards, because everyone in government would love to hire the guy that wrote JFK's speeches. And they would always say, like, I want a speech like JFK's speeches. And he would stop them and be like, listen, I'm going to write you a great speech. It's going to be very good, but you're no JFK. No matter who reads it, if it's not him, it's not going to be that good. And then the second thing, which really made a big difference to me, to think that I just have to write the best possible speech I can. I then have to work and coach the person who's going to be giving it as much as I can. But it's down to them to deliver. It's down to them to execute. That was one really important thing I learned. The second one was that, what was the second one? I was building up to the good one. The second one was the good one, was that he had written a speech for someone he had never met before, which he didn't like to do. He liked to at least have a quick conversation beforehand, but he was in a hurry, and the other person was in a hurry, and they never actually crossed paths. He just had a page of bullet points that he knew this gentleman wanted to cover. And when the person got it back, the feedback was effusive. Like, this is amazing. Like, you nailed my voice perfectly. Like, that's awesome. And I can't believe, like, this is why you're the best. Like, even though you've only seen me on TV, you still nailed exactly how I sound like. And his point was, if you make the person sound really smart, they're going to be convinced that's their voice. So if you really, really good writing is always going to be the voice of the person giving it. Now, the way I carried those 2 points over to what I was doing here was that, well, first of all, the way I carried them over was fraught with anxiety, because I was going through the second rewrite. I did 3 rewrites total on this before it saw the light of day. And during that second rewrite, when I was adding a lot of dialogue and then trying to fine tune the dialogue that was already there, because draft number 1 was just pure exposition, just paragraphs at a time of then this happens and then this happens and then the person felt this way. It's just unreadable. And so I was turning, pages at a time of dialogue, of exposition, into conversations. And my big concern, that anxiety that I mentioned, was, do all of these people sound the same? Like, they're all thoughtful and clever and insightful, and they all have good intentions, even if they're not really all working out, or they're trying to do the right thing, but are they? Like, that's all subtext, but do they sound alike? And because, like I said, they all are clever and thoughtful. And I'm like, and how do you write someone that's not clever and not thoughtful? Are they just saying dumb things? And is that then hard to read? And that is why I really had to ask a couple people to take a look at that book in between that second and third draft. And fortunately for me, that idea of smart writing just sounds like someone's voice, that I ended up on the right side of that. The feedback I got was, these people are all so interesting, and I can really get a sense of their personality. I'm like, oh, thank goodness. Now, I don't know if that was necessarily because of how I made them talk as much as the scenarios and the settings I was putting them in. And so that's one thing that really helped as well, that, this book plays out partially in India, partially in China, and then a big chunk in North America, specifically my part of the country. But then there's also some things that are happening on the East Coast. So if we think about those 4 really different regions, because they were such different places that had such different needs, the characters had such different motivations, they were having very, very different conversations. I think if you were to isolate all the talking that was happening, my worst fears are maybe realized, that everyone does sound a little bit alike. But I was able to put them in different enough scenarios, and they had different motivations, such that they had very different things to talk about. And so that's as a author with a limited mastery of human dialogue, that's how I got around that.
Okay, all right. And then the idea too that you would write for another voice for a speech or for a ghostwritten book, now you're giving voice to characters that you've created. Without you having that ability to give them a voice, your characters really have no voice. So you've created the characters for Chandelier, but now you got to voice them as well, right? You got to get into who they are. I love that you've qualified that you didn't want all of your characters to sound similar. That's interesting, because you go through your day, how many people are exactly the same? As you go to the store, as you go downtown, as you get in a car, whatever, you're going to meet a variety of people, different backgrounds, educational levels, different dialects, everything. You're going to meet all these variety of people, and we don't all sound the same. So you got to bring that into your writing. That's good points.
Yeah. It was, and it helps to have someone in mind that you might know who has 1 or 2 things that are similar to what you need that person to have. Like, there's a very prominent character in my book who, in the first draft, I was very similar, had two or three really strong characteristics that were very similar to my wife. And in that first draft, it was very her on the page. And then now, by the time it got done, those were all gone, almost entirely gone. But that was helpful as just a scaffolding to be like, what would she say in this situation? What would she do in this situation? Someone with these personality traits, would they accept that explanation, or would they come back with like, what the hell are you talking about?
Right.
Like, that's nonsense. We're not going to do that. Like, that was useful to have that person as a stand-in. And then by the second draft, by the third draft, a lot of that stuff was gone, but I still had someone with good directions and good impulses and good instincts that could serve one of those, was one of those characters. And I did that pretty regularly. Like, just there is one scene where this person needs to sort through a problem. I'm like, this character is kind of like my friend Greg. What would he do here? I mean, is that lazy writing? Maybe. Or am I trying to tap into something human? I prefer the second one, even if it's more of the first one. But, using real people to try to help you understand motivations and backstory goes a really, really long way. And writing out, giving examples of people's backstory helps too. That was the major flaw of the first draft, was there's just people doing things, and their actions might be rational, but how did they reach those conclusions? Like, why are they making a split second decision that goes one way or the other? And a couple paragraphs of backstory can help do wonders for the reader understanding someone's emotion, traumas that have made them so hard-nosed about something, or more willing to be patient when something difficult is happening. Like, really spending the time and doing the work to make them a more complete person goes a really long way.
Are there elements of one of your characters that resemble Ben Hawken at all? Like, is there somebody that really stands out? Like, who in the book would be one of the most directly close to who you are?
So the main character in the book has a husband who the handful of details that are revealed about him are dangerously and sometimes unflatteringly close to me. So that's the husband in the story is definitely.
Okay, good. All right. The one thing when I talk to authors around the whole creative process, you talk about all the variety of the characters and who they are. There's a quote, something along the lines that you should dig a well before you're thirsty. So as an author, to kind of build all of that, you pull in all these different people that you use as references, you're bringing all these scenes and you're creating worlds, to kind of dig all that before you start writing and getting really into it, because you've got all this depth of character. You've got all these people that you're kind of saying, oh, that person reminds me of this character. Like, you're building the well and digging it before you really start to draw from it. Do you kind of see that for yourself? Does that resonate with you, to dig the well before you're thirsty?
Yeah, that was what came in so handy with that outlining process that I went through. And I know that I've seen a lot of discussions that are back and forth on, should you be programming everything that's going to happen in your book, everything that's going to happen in your book in advance, or should you just have this open stream of consciousness style of writing you're going to go do? And at the risk of having a boring answer and saying it's in the middle of those two, I think it's in the middle of those two, meaning in my outline, I had the basics of the story all mapped out. Well, in all disclosure, I was writing chapter 3 or 4 when I figured out what the ending would be. That's how open-ended I let this very structured outline be. I think I was in chapter 2 or so where it occurred to me, like, who's the bad guy in this story? Do we have a protagonist? Do we have an antagonist to this story? Like, I feel like books need something for our main character to bounce off of. Crap. And so I was putting that together. But this outline, as it existed, the 45 pages of it, in some sections, it was very programmatic that, hey, this occurs, this is the reaction, this is the problem, and this happened. And then here we are by the end of the chapter. Chapter 2 picks up with the dust having settled, and here we go again. It was, in some sections, it was really straightforward like that. And there were many other places where the entire outline for chapter 19 was, it was like, there's chaos everywhere and someone has to solve it. Now they're in the woods. like I just knew that was where we were going to land. And as I started writing, I'd get to that. If that's chapter 17, by the time I was in 11, let's say, enough had changed in those first couple chapters. And whenever something changed, I would go back and make a note saying, all right, we remember in chapter 20, this doesn't work anymore. I delete it and put in what was now really going to happen based on events. So I was allowing there to be still enough chaos in the story that if something sprung to mind that was very different but really compelling, that went in. Like, hey, prior planning, thanks for being here. We appreciate your service, but a new idea has popped up, and so off we'd go. And it was a matter of making those edits. Now, like, okay, in chapter 33, remember this happened. Also in chapter 37, I'm gonna need to remember this happened. And so the outline was a very much a living, evolving document as I went. And sometimes I would stop writing, in the middle of chapter 20 and just spend a couple of hours outlining some stuff that I knew was going to have to happen in the last chapter now, because I didn't want to lose it. And so that is digging the well and installing the pipes and, bringing it, putting a pump and doing everything in advance. And, that the outline is able to keep so many of your good ideas and keep them somewhere fresh, but never feel chained down to that. I mean, let there still be some chaos, because, life does crazy things, like unexpected things happen. People say things out of the blue that change whatever it is you're doing. And you have to, and if you want your book to feel really authentic, if you want those stories and those people to feel authentic, you have to be able to account for something going down that's going to, throw a wrench in your gears.
Yeah.
And let that wrench be in the gears of your story, not just you, now you're wringing your hands in front of your keyboard saying, what am I going to say now?
Right.
And that was a really great way to solve for writer's block is, I knew where I needed to go every day, but I could let it ramble a little bit to get there.
My friend this is an interesting segue, but anyways, my friend is a chainsaw sculpture guy who can take a log and turn it into something. So he can like take a big, huge log and turn it into a bear. And I asked him, like, how do you know how to do that? He said, well, it's pretty simple, actually. You just take off everything that doesn't look like a bear. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, that makes sense. And so I guess as a writer, when you're doing all your forming and building world, you just take off the things that don't matter, as you talk about. You're kind of building it as you go, right? You just kind of chip away at it till you end up with the final product, and that's where you end up. So it's kind of an interesting comparison between cutting up a log and writing a book, I guess.
It's also a great way to look at the editing process. In between my second and third drafts, I'm trying to see if I have a copy of it somewhere around here. I paused for a moment and was reading Stephen King's part memoir, part textbook on how to write novels. It's called very creatively titled On Writing. And one of the things he mentions is your second draft should be your first draft minus 10%.
Oh.
And I thought that was a really interesting way to look at it, that when you're writing and for me, I kind of did that between the second and third drafts. And that, because there's so many things that are in there that you are just passionate about. Like I went down some rabbit holes about tectonic plates and the mathematics that try and fail to explain why time only goes in one direction. Wow. And like, I went down like what kind of alloys are used in the fins of torpedoes for our Navy versus our, meaning the United States Navy, versus the Indian Navy, like just random weird things. And you find these things that are very interesting and like, oh, this is a plot point in the story. And then when you're rereading it, you're like, did I have a ton of extra time that day that I'm two paragraph deeps on the type of like the octane of fuel that jets use, like, or like how many trillions of electrons are released by an electromagnetic pulse. Like I had nothing better to do that day. And you have to put your shoes you put yourself in the reader's shoes at that point. You spend a lot of time in the shoes of your characters, trying to empathize with them and understand that even the people you don't like, you have to have some sympathy for so you can write realistically for them. Well, you need to have some sympathy for your readers. And 3 paragraphs on, jet fuel or what direction the scales on a dinosaur would point during which phase of the Triassic period, which are all things that I put in and then later deleted from the book. That can be a sentence. It should be a sentence. It should not be 3 paragraphs. And so we talk about whittling away, because once you've condensed those 3 paragraphs into the sentence and a half that it should have been to start with, that is the most information rich sentence ever. And you have done your audience an incredible service by packing it all into one and letting them get on with the story.
I love it. Beautiful. Okay, that's good. So you are going to do something which is exciting, and I'm happy to spotlight this on the show as you prepare yourself. You're going to read a little bit for us from your book, which I'm really excited about. So as you're getting yourself ready there to do so, I love the idea of an audiobook. I love the idea of hearing the author reading to us because it's in your voice. You're the one that wrote the words, and I could read it in my context, in my knowledge, and how I would approach it. But to hear it written or read to us by the person who's written this, I just feel it gives us different nuance to the story, and you're going to accent things that are meaningful to you as the writer that, again, bring me into the story in a different way. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Do you need to set this up at all before you read to us?
So in chapter 9 of Chandelier, available on Amazon and benhawken.com. I can't say that without laughing. This is chapter 9, and at this point, the back of the cover explanation, which is how would you say, intentionally vague. I'll make it slightly less vague, which is I got the idea because in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was a program that the government used called the Stargate Project. This was a real thing. Congress investigated it. It was all very weird. They were using children from all over the United States. They would pretend the CIA. This is once again, go to Wikipedia. Don't take my word for it that this is something that I found on 4chan at 2 a.m. Is they would go through. They go up and down the Atlantic coast to elementary schools, and they would microdose children with LSD to see if they had psychic abilities. And the ones who showed promise were brought to the West Coast to a lab in the Bay Area where they would be taught how to project their consciousness to Russia to read the names of spies off of, a book in KGB headquarters, or what are the launch codes in a silo somewhere in Siberia. This was a very real program that did a lot of work. And then one day it was discovered to be running, and that even for the quagmire-like ethical gray areas that any of these programs have to exist in, it was bad even by those standards. And so they shut it all down. And so there were a lot of kids who woke up in the Bay Area one morning knowing that they were one of the most important pieces of the United States' defense against, communism. And by the end of the day, they were getting ready to go home because they'd been told none of this was ever real and none of this ever worked. So that's a real story. Give it a Google, and it's on there. I heard about the story and thought, what does that do to the kids' ability to trust adults ever again? What does that do to you when you go back home to the cul-de-sac you lived in and you see people who are like bummed out about, local sports team lost this weekend, or like, I gotta pay taxes, or why is my grass dying? Like, I gotta mow the lawn again. Like, everyone's problems are hilariously dumb to you now. What does that do to the people? How do you relate to people ever again? How do you, when you're raising your own kids and your kids have problems, being like, really, this is your problem? A crayon broke? Like, someone at school didn't invite you to their birthday party? Cry me a river. Like, what kind of people does this produce? Well, there is no scary LSD program in my book, but there is a project that requires some young participants to help out to serve their country during the Second World War. It's not like scary Stranger Things stuff, but it is, it draws upon this same age group. And then when the project is over, all these kids have to go back, including the main character, whose name is Sienna, who I'll read about in this passage, have to go home and get on with their lives. Now, the rest of the book takes place in the present day, and hey, there's a new problem brewing. There is no idea about how to solve it, but people seem to remember in the archives, there was a project a really long time ago, and we actually know where a few of those people still are who participated. What if we could get them to help? And our main character is really not inclined to get involved with all of that riffraff again. And so then it's a question of, one of the existential questions, I suppose, is, are you the type of person who takes action, or do you wait for the world to take action on you? And, how proactive are you going to be, like, personally and philosophically? And so that question then is how our main character sorts through the second half of the book.
All right.
So where I pick up today, our main character, Sienna, is still at this as a part of this program and loving it. It is the happiest she's ever been. She has a purpose. She has a team. She has friends, and off she goes. So this is chapter 9 of Chandelier.
Yeah.
This is February 6th, 1990. 4 months had passed in quick succession for Sienna. The breaks at Thanksgiving and Christmas had helped the time pass, but Sienna was enamored with the work she was doing. This was the most exciting opportunity a child of the 80s with bottomless curiosity could be offered, and every moment in that chair was spent eagerly hunting within the great emptiness and scouring the insides of her mind as if set loose on a scavenger hunt of heroism. This attitude was very common amongst her classmates, and this, combined with the culture and tone set by Dr. Torkman, made it easy for this collective of like-minded and like-purposed campers to get along more often than not. The campers traded notes about what they saw and heard, despite the fact that this would almost certainly taint the data in any other experimental project, and the typical juvenile exaggerations were kept to a minimum, since it was impossible to claim you have spotted something big without there being a corresponding spike on a dozen different sensors monitoring your brain. That morning in class, a new teacher introduced herself as a strategist from the National Security Agency. The class was currently in the middle of a unit on ecosystems, and most of yesterday was spent walking back and forth across Sugarloaf Mountain to find leaves and insects to put in a jar and label it as something representing a lower woodland biome. The new teacher had found this exercise particularly exciting because, as she explained it, the specific nature of her work had to do with astrobiology, or said another way, her research was focused on how to detect, from thousands of light years away, if there might be life on distant planets. Eventually, the class would learn enough to understand that her specialty was designing the technology and the methodology that astronomers used when looking through a telescope at the ring of light surrounding a distant planet's silhouette. And then when they analyzed how the light refracted through that planet's atmosphere, certain conclusions could be reached about what was happening on the surface. For example, if the light refracted a very specific way, it meant there were specific chemicals in that atmosphere, and the presence of certain chemicals was evidence of minerals being burned. And a certain type of burnt mineral could indicate an intelligent civilization heating its homes or powering its factories. Hypothetically, at least. Today's discussion quickly became a hybrid of the ongoing ecosystems unit and her own study of how life began and thrived, whether here on Earth or anywhere else her technology might someday detect it. "What kind of life are you trying to find on other planets?" Kelsey asked. "The only thing we really know," she explained, "is that if there's anything out there at all, then there are about 1,000,000 different shapes it can take. And that can be anything from slime to stuff that flies or anything in between." "So you don't think aliens would look a lot like us, but just with some weird ridge on their forehead?" Sam asked, hoping to find some validation for his critique that all the Star Trek aliens were lame, because they were obviously humans with extra makeup and some rubber knobs glued to their faces. The teacher laughed and said she agreed, but this was the jumping off point for something along the lines of, "Well, the first thing to understand about how any life form evolves is that evolution is entirely dependent on where that organism is doing its evolving. This is a pretty simple principle, but it gets overlooked a lot. I mean, the animals here on Earth, ourselves included, we evolved so that they could make better use of their specific ecosystem where they lived and developed, and they developed bodies and brains that would help them do that. And those bodies and brains were meant to not just help them survive wherever it was they were living, but also to help them survive things that wanted to eat them. So over time, those bodies grew to thrive in an ecosystem's temperature, to move across its type of land, and to eat whatever grew in that area. So after a couple 100,000 years, everything on that animal has been affected by where it lives, from the shape of its stomach to how it sleeps to the way its muscles wrap around its skeleton. And its brains and instincts are built to take advantage of those common threats. This left the class thinking about their own unique physical variations and what could have happened in some ancient ecosystem that allowed them the ability to listen to Russian radio stations. "So even our brains are changed by where our ancestors lived?" Sienna asked. The teacher nodded, started to grab a piece of chalk, and then decided just to explain it instead. It sounds kind of weird that the type of wild landscape where your ancestors evolved can impact how you think or act today. But if you follow our trail back through history, that's what you end up finding. Now, don't get me wrong, you can't blame your decisions on where your ancestors evolved, but all the pathways in your brain that your thoughts and your reasoning take in order to reach all the conclusions that you believe, those things were established a long time ago based on what your ancestors needed to survive where they lived. That doesn't mean all your choices were made for you, but it does mean that all your thinking is done with equipment that was built a long time ago to do things like build forts and make food. And because our brains are constructed with such a limited use in mind, we're left with the sobering reality that there are types of thoughts and conclusions that our brains simply cannot ever reach. Sienna's mind was racing at what this implied about the astrobiology they discussed earlier. So aliens are thinking different things than us? That's right. We have no idea what they're thinking, but they will have evolved in a completely different ecosystem that has given them a different brain, and that means they have completely different thoughts. They come up with different ideas and they reach different conclusions. The teacher considered for a moment which direction to take this next, and she wondered if she should ruin the genre of science fiction for them forever. Based on our discussion today, what is the flaw in every book or movie about aliens showing up and taking over the planet? And I'll give you a hint. It's not that aliens arrived here in the first place. So this dives in then to a big discussion of like what power means. Like if some alien civilization is powerful enough to get here, they don't need anything from us. If they can make it all this distance, we have nothing to offer them. And if they can go that kind of distance, then they've already conquered everything worth conquering. And we're not one of the things they need to add to the list. Instead, when we write about, oh, these mean aliens showed up and took everything over, it's because that's what we would do. That's what happens when humans find other less powerful humans. But if you have a different brain that has different thoughts, you probably wouldn't show up here and do exactly what we would do.
Right.
I guess that's also a reason not to be too worried about AI. If you're infinitely wise and can infinitely process and compute ideas, destroying things probably isn't that exciting to you. So anyway, it's this chapter takes place in a classroom. After the 15th chapter, there's no more classrooms, but it does introduce a lot of concepts that get explored in the real world later.
Ben, I love that you read to us. First of all, that's amazing to hear it from you. As I'm watching you read this to me, I can see it on your face. You know what's coming next. You're like, oh, here comes a good part. I can see it all over you. So it's great. I love that experience as a reader, as a listener of audiobooks as well. It takes you somewhere. It's really cool. Thank you for doing that.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's like asking you which one of your kids you love the most. It's like I would happily read and talk about this one forever.
I love it. Okay, so Ben, as we wrap up, take us to your website. I have had it up the whole time we've been chatting. It's a beautiful website, by the way. Take us there and kind of next steps for a reader who's interested in talking to you more or connecting with you. I know you love getting reviews. Feedback is always great. I know we have listeners who would love to speak with you somehow, but take us to your website.
Yeah, so benhawken.com, that's Hawken. I know you've never seen it spelled that way before. Neither have I, outside of my family. It's just us with the Ken. But benhawken.com has links to, you can email, you can go to Amazon, you can find all the social media accounts. There's Instagram and Facebook are the only two that I'm old enough to use. Or I guess not too old to use. And there is, and available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble too. So there's no shortage of ways to check out the book itself. And then I'd say that we're talking here in like mid to late October, and I'm thinking we're probably 2 weeks away from having the audiobook available as well. So that'll be there soon.
Excellent. The title of my show is Living the Next Chapter. So my question, Ben, to you is, now that this is in the world and the audiobook's almost behind you, how are you living your next chapter?
I would love to say that book number 2 is on the way. It isn't yet, though. This particular book ends in such a way that there isn't a sequel. Not in a bad way, necessarily, but there is no sequel to this one coming up. So I enjoyed this process of writing it so much that the next chapter is going to be what disparate points can I connect to tell another story and do it again soon. I can't wait to get started.
Excellent. Everybody, all the information for Ben is in the show notes as always. Would love for you to go buy the book and also buy the audiobook as it comes out as well, and share this with somebody, because this is really going to help Ben to sell more books. Obviously, that's the goal of doing all of this. And I would love for you as well to leave an amazing review for Ben's work, because that's going to bring more people to Ben and to this amazing book. And as you hang your next chandelier, make sure you have a copy of this book to stand on. It'll make you a little taller. Awesome way to do that. It's a great resource as a footstep. No, I'm just kidding. It's something you need in your life. You need chandelier, right?
Once you've made the purchase, do whatever you want with it. I have friends of mine, like when you write a book, I know we're wrapping up, but I'll say when you write a book, you find out how many of your friends don't read. Because the number of people I see at the grocery store or at a kid's t-ball game or something, and they're like, hey, I got your book. I'm like, thanks. And then you see them a second time, like, I still haven't read it. I'm like, you don't need to. Purchase made. I've collected the royalty. We're done. Thank you for supporting the arts.
I love it. Ben, thank you so much for doing this. It's great to have you on the show. If you do have something in the future, the door's open. I'll keep the seat warm for you. Come back and give us an update in the future on the next thing as you live your next chapter.
100%.
Hey, thanks for being here for the Living the Next Chapter podcast. So glad to have you as part of our family of listeners. There's a seat for you just here on Living the Next Chapter, and I'm so happy that you have listened to all the way to the end. Wow, you are now my new bestie. I want to let you know that I host 7 other podcasts on top of Living the Next Chapter. Yep, 8 total. One of them is called the How To Podcast series. If you are thinking, you know what, Dave, this podcast thing seems like a lot of fun. Well, I'll give you a secret. It is. It's a great, amazing, fun time where you can get to meet great people, get your word out there, promote your book, promote what your coaching program, whatever you're doing. Podcasting is great. And if you want to learn how to do this, what you're hearing right now, head over to howtopodcast.ca and look up the How to Podcast series on YouTube, whatever app you're listening on. You'll find me there. And I'd love for you to come listen to How to Do This. And if you're interested and have questions on how to podcast, reach out to me at howtopodcast.ca. Thank you for listening. Talk soon.